So I was telling you last time, Bergson's theory of comedy can be approached in three ways. There are three major dimensions to it. The first and most important is to understand what I call the comic element. And that's what he believes to be the essence of comedy. And it's this juxtaposition between this natural flow of life, which for Bergson is a ceaseless flow of novelty being animated by a particular project. At the core of life is what he calls the élan vital, the vital impulse that's moving and being animated by a particular project, whatever's going on in life. And when humans become overly mechanical and inelastic, whether it be in speech or with their bodies, or it can be the very physiognomy of the face or the human body, it creates a tension between the natural flow of reality and this mechanical inelasticity. And whenever these are juxtaposed together in any way, it creates comic situations or comic words, and people burst out laughing. So the three aspects then that you could look for in doing your readings, Bergson's little book, Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic, are first the comic element, that is the essence of comedy. He introduces that by way of a series of examples that we went over, and then shows that thread that runs through them all. And then he returns to that throughout the book. That's what's going to animate the whole book. So that's the main thing you need to get a hold of. But once you begin to understand that, then he articulates a series of what I call comic formulae. I think he uses the word formula once or twice in the book himself. So these are particular structures that when they're embodied, they become comical. But the secret is to see how each of these comic formulae are rooted in that comic element. They're all going to be having something to do with this mechanical inelasticity, this collision, this tension that takes place between the natural flow of life and the mechanical. And so whenever you, the second element then is this myriad of this plethora of comic formulae, and you want to identify as many as you can. You could even, I would divide my notes if I were to take notes on this. Every time he talks about what may be associated with the comic element, I would put them all in one section of my notes, and then make a list, enumerate all these comic formulae and give them a name. He names them himself. And then try to think about how they're all rooted in the comic element. That way you'll understand it. The third most important dimension of his theory is the function of comedy. And I'll talk about that somewhat. And that he returns to that. So let me just identify a few of these comic formulae for you, and then I'll let you do this kind of scavenger hunt. You know, sometimes when you're reading, it's nice to look for things. That way you're reading with a purpose. So when you're reading, you can look for these comic formulae. And when you identify them, try to understand what he's saying, and then realize that whenever they're embodied, the embodiment can take on a myriad of forms. It's like learning what a minor chord is. Once you know a minor chord, how the structure of it is, it can take on all kinds of forms depending on what part of the music it's being played. So whenever a formula is embodied, it can take on all kinds of forms. But you want to get, the formula is the structure of something, like the skeleton of it. So it helped me to understand Bergson's theory of comedy by knowing something of his metaphysics, since I studied his metaphysics. So the metaphysics is the study of reality, and the history of philosophy is essentially the history of metaphysics, because every philosopher has his or her own theory of reality. So as I was saying, for you, with Bergson, he's different from most metaphysicians in claiming that reality is a ceaseless flow of novelty, that reality is in the making, that nothing, the world is not already constituted, it's not there to be known as much it is in the making, it's unfolding before us, and we're part of that unfolding. So whenever you are, and even in his theory of comedy, in this book, Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic, he touches upon his metaphysics only to show by contrast how the mechanical is encrusted on that, and it becomes comical. For example, on page 44, he talks about life. For Bergson, life is reality. So these two words are synonymous. He says life itself presents itself to us as an evolution in time and a complexity in space. So he's talking about reality or life in terms of space and time. So when he thinks about how is reality with regard to time, well, things are continuously unfolding, and things grow older, they mature, situations mature, people mature, animals mature, plants, situations, they mature, they unfold, they evolve, and they're moving. And things never go backwards. Time doesn't go backwards. And things don't repeat themselves. Well, they do in a sense, like the seasons come around, the days come around, but not in a mechanical way. They don't repeat themselves like a piston going up and down, in a carburetor. So that's how life moves. It's evolving, it never goes backwards, and it doesn't repeat itself in a mechanical way. That's how he thinks about life temporally. What about spatially? Well, he says, considered in space, it exhibits certain coexisting elements. So any situation has elements, has parts, but these parts coexist. Co means with, exist means exist, right? The happening. So the parts fit together in a situation. And he says these parts coexist so closely, are they interdependent, that these parts reflect on each other, so exclusively made for one another, that not one of them could at the same time belong to two different organisms. Okay, so, like even a human body, all the parts fit together. If somebody has a trunk, from an elephant, then that becomes comical. If you have a picture of a human being and then he has a trunk instead of a nose. And the reason that's comical is because the trunk comes from an elephant and the nose goes with a human. So all of Bergson is, he's stating something obvious, but he's setting something up to show what makes for comedy. So whenever we have a situation or a body or any organism, and a situation is kind of an organism because it's a coexistence of parts, and all the parts belong together so intimately and so perfectly that they create a closed system of phenomena. And these parts are incapable of interfering with other systems or other constellations of forces that make up situations or bodies. So then he summarizes a continuously change of aspect, that's the temporal dimension, the irreversible ability of the order of phenomenon, that's also the temporal aspect. Things just don't go backwards in time. And the perfect individuality of a perfectly self-contained series, that's the spatial dimension of reality. Such then are the outward characteristics which distinguish the living from the merely mechanical. Okay, So that's what life is all about. It moves forward, it evolves, it's flowing. It doesn't go backwards. It doesn't repeat itself in a mechanical way. All the parts fit together in order to create a meaningful situation. Well, then he says, let us look at the counterpart of these. So now let's see what happens when these become distorted in a mechanical way. What you have then is mechanical repetition, or you have inversion, or you have the reciprocal interference of a series. And so these become the basis, the principles of comic formulae. Mechanical repetition, for example. If somebody is giving a speech and they keep saying the same thing over and over again, it becomes comical. After a while, people just start counting how many times the person says something. Or in the film, Young Frankenstein, whenever the horses whinny, make that sound that horses make, it always takes place after they say the word Frau Blucher. And what's so funny about that is that it just happens mechanically in a repetitive way. Well, there's this series, it's been on television for a while now. It's called Keeping Up Appearances. It's a British sitcom. And there's one situation where Elizabeth, who lives next door, comes to Hyacinth's house for tea. She does this in every episode. And every time she comes, she gets so nervous being with Hyacinth that she drops the tea and spills it all over the place. The same thing happens every time with just very minor differences. And it's comical every time. And the reason it's comical is because of the sheer repetition of it. Or every time Hyacinth, answers the telephone, she goes, the Bouquet residence, lady of the house speaking. And the way she says it, she's trying to keep up appearances. That's the very name of the sitcom. It becomes comical. And it's because of the sheer repetition, the mechanical repetition of it. That's why it's funny. And you just laugh every single time they say it. Or when Larry the Cable Man comes on the stage and he says, "Get her done," it's funny and everyone laughs and they're just waiting for him to say that. It's the way he says it, of course, too, but it's the sheer repetition. So that's one comic formula, just repetition. So when you're watching any film in art or in life, if you see that repetition, that becomes a comic formula because it goes against the way life goes. Life doesn't repeat itself in that mechanical way. Another one is inversion. Topsy-turvydom. Some theorists of comedy believe that this is the essence of comedy. But for Bergson, it's only one comic formula among others. But it's definitely an important one. Whenever there's a mechanical kind of inversion of things are, usually that doesn't happen in life. Like things change, of course, but they don't change abruptly from one opposite to the other. When that happens in a mechanical way, it becomes the occasion for comedy, and it usually evokes laughter. For example, I don't want to make too many connections for you with the film, but I'll make a few, but I hope you would come up with your own when you make your assignments. But in the film Young Frankenstein, for example, at the beginning of the film, the young Frankenstein, he's the son of the Frankenstein who created the monster. Maybe we need to talk about the Frankenstein myth that was created for the first time by Mary Shelley. And then there were 3 films, serious films made of Frankenstein. And then Mel Brooks made the comedy that we're going to watch called Young Frankenstein. At the beginning of the film, the young Frankenstein, the grandson of Frankenstein who created the monster, he doesn't want anything to do with his grandfather's work. And then a series of seeds are planted in him, and as time goes by, he's manipulated by Frau Blucher. And you can watch. We'll watch the movie. You'll see the movie. There's a moment where he becomes obsessed with his grandfather's work, the reanimation of dead matter, and to make a corpse come to life again. So that's an inversion. At first, he doesn't want anything to do with his grandfather's work. Then he's obsessed with his grandfather's work. It's also comical because of the over enthusiasm. Remember, we were talking about the in those examples that he was giving at the beginning. He was talking about Don Quixote as a good example of the over romantic, the person who's not so much absent-minded, but so much obsessed with some ideal that they can't see reality anymore, like Don Quixote in Cervantes. So Young Frankenstein is that way. He becomes obsessed. But right now, so sometimes things are comical for more than one reason. There's a series of, and perhaps the more comic formula that are embodied and put in one particular example that enhances the comedic element, the comedic efficacy of that event. But right now, I just wanted to mention about the inversion. So whenever there's a mechanical inversion in things, it becomes comical. That's another one. And the reciprocal interference of a series, it's like, what he means by that is if something, well, I gave you the silly example of someone's face with a trunk instead of a nose, which becomes comical because, I mean, that's like second grade humor, but it's still comical because it's the trunk doesn't go on a face, right? But it can take on much more subtle dimensions than that. Whenever two things are being said and they come from two different situations and they're superimposed upon one another, like an equivocal situation. A situation is invariably comic, Bergson writes on page 48, when it belongs simultaneously to two altogether independent series of events and is capable of being interpreted in two entirely different meanings at the same time. He never uses the expression, or at least I haven't seen it in the book, double entendre. But it's a French expression. It means things, you say something and it has two meanings at the same time, double meaning, usually a figurative meaning and a literal meaning at the same time. And the film is full of those things. Some are a little bawdy, a little sexual. One of the reasons comedy perhaps hasn't been really studied carefully by philosophy, with the exception of Bergson and these few exceptions, is because of the bawdiness, because of the vulgarity of comedy. Some of it is off color, some of it appeals to, the vulgar and common side of life, and because of that, some people think that it's not really worthy of our serious philosophical reflection. I don't believe that way, and obviously Bergson doesn't, and there are a series of other philosophers who don't think that way either. But so those are three comic formula. I'm going to just point out a few more for you, and I'm going to let you do a kind of scavenger hunt and let you do it yourself. You just you just look for. It's pretty obvious when Bergson lays out. Usually he'll talk about something for a while, and then he gives a summary of it, and he'll say something like, something becomes comical when, and sometimes it's even put in italic print, so it becomes even more obvious. So, like for example, on page 15, there's one. The attitudes, gestures, and movements of the human body are laughable in exact proportion as that body reminds us of a mere machine, or when the body becomes like a thing. So what does he mean by that? Well, the body doesn't move like a machine. Machines move in a certain way. They move in a mechanical way. The body moves, it depends on how graceful the body is. Most bodies that move through life, whether they're human bodies, animal bodies, whatever, they move in a graceful way. All the parts move together. If it starts moving mechanically, then it starts lending its, or when the body becomes a thing. A body is not a thing. It's a living organism that has an interiority, and it's animated by, feelings and thoughts, and it's not a thing like a pound of potatoes. So when the body starts becoming a thing, or it starts moving in a mechanical way, then it lends itself to comedy. That's why, comedians know how to move with their bodies, and they know how to make facial expressions that know how, and they've learned how to make people laugh by that, just walking a certain way. There's one scene in the film Young Frankenstein where Igor, who's the protege of Young Frankenstein, and he has a humpback and he walks in a strange way. The very way he walks is comical. And the way the monster walks, in a kind of machine kind of way, there's a superimposition between the mechanical and the suppleness of the body. So it becomes comical just watching him walk. And then Igor says, "Walk this way." And Young Frankenstein then bends down and walks the very way that Igor is walking, which is a double entendre, right? Because there's two meanings there. Walk this way could mean follow me, I'm going that way. And then walk this way means walk the way I'm walking. So Young Frankenstein follows him and he walks the same way, but he walks in the same manner as Igor is also. So that situation has a double meaning and it becomes comical. I'll point out a few more, and I'm going to let you find these yourself. Then you can find how those are embodied and exemplified in the film. Any incident, he writes on page 25, is comic that calls our attention to the physical in a person when it is the moral that is concerned. There's certain kind of vulgar aspects of this film that are not said, but they're innuendos, they're implied, they're alluded to. And it's a kind of spoiler, but Elizabeth in the film, Young Frankenstein, is not going to have sex with her fiance, Young Frankenstein, until they get married, because she wants to be moral and not have sex outside of marriage. But then when she's abducted by the monster, suddenly she falls in love with the monster. And has nothing to, suddenly it's about his physicality that she's in love with. She sings, "Oh, my love, I finally found you." So now it's the monster that she falls in love with, but not because of any virtuous characteristic on his part. It's only because of his physicality. So it goes, that transition, that inversion from her wanting to preserve herself because of moral reasons, and then suddenly falling in love with the monster because of his physicality, that embodies perfectly, this formulae. Any incident is comic that calls our attention to the physical in a person when it is the moral side that is concerned. I mean, the whole reason she's not having sex with her fiance, which is Young Frankenstein, is because she doesn't want to have sex outside of marriage. Bergson, I'll point out three more comic formulae, and then I'll let you dig out the rest yourself. That way you make it your own by discovering it yourself. the book is full of these comic formulae, and to understand them fully, you want to see how they're rooted in the comic element, how they're all going to be somehow this juxtaposition of the mechanical with the living, fluid reality. He talks about, at the beginning of the second chapter, and I would like you to read the whole book. It's not a long book. I mean, I'm not going to test you on the book, so you read as much of it as you like. I mean, this is not grade school, so you just, however much you put into it, that's what you get out of it. So if you go through your college career and you do the least amount of reading, you're going to get the least amount of knowledge from your college experience, and but if you want to get the most of this, read the whole book if you can, but at least chapter 1 for sure. But if you don't read chapters 2 and 3, then you're not going to see all these other comic formula, and then you won't be able to notice them in the film. So, and then you won't see it in language, and the book, it's not that long. Actually, this book was made up of 3 individual essays that he published for the people, not for it wasn't published originally as a book, but it was in 3 separate magazine articles. And then he just created transition and made it a nice little, I think it's a little masterpiece on comedy. But at the beginning of chapter 2, he talks he begins in a way, or is it in chapter 3? Let me see if it's 2 or 3. No, it's at the beginning of chapter 2. He talks about how much of the joy of life comes from reminiscing of these joyful things that happen in your childhood, and it's a very philosophical kind of thought there. It made me think about my love of dogs now as an old man, and I think back when I was a boy with my dog in the woods, and when I grew up out in the country, in those moments in the winter time when I would watch my dog playing in the woods, and now I have this love for dogs still, and I have dogs and train them and do dog sports. And so what Bergson is saying is much of the joy we have in life is nothing other than a kind of recollection and reminiscing and repetition of things that happen in our childhood. And then he focuses on 3 things that most children played with when they were young. And one is the jack in the box. And apparently, I thought it was a kind of an American phenomenon, but Bergson is French, so they must have had it it's a European phenomenon. You may have had one when you were a child, I'm not sure. But when I was one, they have these little jack in the boxes where usually it made a little song too. Pop goes the weasel, and this jack in the box would jump out, and it's a little toy that little children, it makes kids laugh, actually. It's called the jack in the box. Little man who springs out of the box. Well, and so he talks about that, and it makes little kids laugh. But that can take on forms in comedy where it's not a jack in the box anymore, but the structure is the same. There's a repression, a kind of holding back of energy. Because what makes the child laugh is the anticipation of this little man popping out suddenly. And they know it's going to pop out, and they're waiting. And then when it pops out, they laugh. So there's this repression or suppression of energy. And then, boom, suddenly it explodes. Okay? So he calls this the jack in the box. Well, that can take on this springing forth, this sudden catharsis of energy can take the form of comedy in more figurative ways. he says, now let us think of a spring that is rather of a moral type, an idea that is at first expressed, then repressed, and then expressed again, a stream of words that bursts forth in checking, in keeping on starting afresh. So you can look for that in the world. Actually, it just dawned on me when I just said that, I was thinking about sense of humor. You know, part of having a good sense of humor is be able to notice these things that Bergson is talking about. So, you know, one time when I was teaching this years ago, someone raised their hand and said, you think it's perverse, you know, to be thinking seriously about comedy? Isn't it enough just to laugh? Why do we have to think philosophically about comedy? And that made me think, actually. I went home and I gave it some thought. And I came back and answered I said, I don't think that giving philosophical thought to comedy reduces one's sense of humor, because I've heard comedians talk seriously about comedy, and usually they've thought very deeply about comedy in a serious way. Of course, when they're creating comedy, they're not analyzing it and why it's funny or anything like that. Like, they're not doing a philosophy of comedy like Bergson is doing. But a lot of them are very aware, like the writers of Monty Python. These people are quite aware of, I don't know if they read Bergson or not, but they're quite aware about what makes people laugh and why and so on. But it just dawned on me now as I was talking, it seems to me that the more one would become aware of these comic formulae, then one becomes sensitive to that in life. And that enhances rather than decreases one's sense of humor. It's good to have a good sense of humor, because it surely makes life much more pleasant. And there's always something less than human about somebody who doesn't have a developed sense of humor. Okay, so the Jack in the Box, that's a comic formula, this repression, and Gene Wilder, who plays the Young Frankenstein, is a master at this, in holding back energy and then exploding with emotion or thoughts or whatever. I mean, comedians have a skill in doing that. They can hold back and then suddenly just explode. Another is on page 39, another little toy that children play with. It's called the dancing jack. That's the French, that's the translation of the French. Really, it's a marionette. They're marionettes where somebody's pulling the strings and the marionette moves. And notice the marionette moves in a kind of human way, you know, but it's also mechanical because it's strings that are making the marionette move. Human movements are much more fluid and supple and graceful than that. And that's one reason why the marionette is comical. But the other reason is that it's being manipulated. And Bergson concentrates on the manipulation. So children watch, you know, puppet shows and marionettes, and these have been around since the ancient Greek times, the Romans. Oh, and even in Asia, I know they have puppet shows. In Indonesia, they have the shadow plays of the puppets, and some of them, and the puppets are quite artfully done, actually. But what Bergson is talking about is how this same thing can be taken over into comedy. And so we have a character or a person who's being manipulated. And of course, they don't know they're being manipulated. That's what it means to be manipulated, right? You're being manipulated to do something by somebody else. And that very manipulation is a form of absent-mindedness, because if you were mindful, you would know you're being manipulated and you wouldn't be manipulated. So there's this, what he calls the dancing jack, Well, you can see this all the way through the film. I could point out points in the film where the monster's being manipulated. You could look for characters being manipulated. Young Frankenstein gets manipulated. Whenever there's a manipulation and somebody's doing something in an absent-minded way because they're being manipulated by someone else, then that is a comic formula, like a marionette moving in a mechanical way. Oh, the third one he talks about on page 39 is the snowball. Kids play with snowballs, and the snowball gets bigger and bigger, and sometimes gets really big. So that can be a comic formulae also, because something can start very small and get bigger and bigger and bigger gradually, and then when it gets so big, it becomes out of hand. And that is called the snowball effect. And he talks about that. So I'm going to stop there. There are so many other, especially in language, we haven't talked about very much, but I'll let you look for those in your readings. Look for the comic formulae. Look for any kind of structure that when it's embodied, it grows out of this comic element, this superimposition between this mechanical inelasticity and the suppleness and the unfolding of reality. I want to mention one more thing. I think it's the most philosophical aspect of the book, and it helps you to understand the book much better. And it's the function of comedy. And Bergson will mention it here and there, but to get a full understanding of that, you would have to gather together all the times that he mentions the function of comedy and bring it all together in a cohesive idea. He never really says the function of comedy, but that's what he's talking about. That is the effect of comedy on humans. And basically, comedy has this corrective function, because comedy is, for the most part, ridicule. And there's all kinds of forms of comedy too. There's parody, there are puns, which is like the most basic, lowest level of comedy, the pun. Or there's satire, there's parody, there's different kinds of comedy. And he talks about all these different forms of comedy. But no matter what form it takes, for Bergson, there's always some ridicule. Actually, I know the Italian language somewhat, and I know in Italian, which is the closest language to Latin, ridere, R-I-D-E-R-E, is the infinitive to laugh, and it must be connected to ridicule. So laughter and ridicule are intimately connected, even etymologically. So whenever there's laughter, there's some element of ridicule that's going on. Now, usually ridicule is some overt expression, like you make fun of somebody, overtly. So there's a corrective going on. But the corrective is implicit. So there's a metaphysical correction going on, because if somebody's acting in a mechanical way and it becomes comical and the comedian brings that out and exaggerates that, we didn't talk about exaggeration. He talks at length about exaggeration. Then there's a correction going on. So we're sitting in the audience and we're watching like Elizabeth, who's very vain. And so Bergson talks about comic vices. So vanity is a vice. Now, vices can be tragic too. And he gives some rules when vice becomes comic and when it's tragic. If it's in art and the vice becomes so exaggerated that the vice seems to manipulate the person, then it becomes comical. If it brings the actual downfall of the person, then, and it's just a part of their interiority, then it's tragic. So, for example, in the film, Elizabeth is quite vain. And part of being a vain person is to not know you're vain. So everybody else can see your vanity and you don't see it yourself. There's always this absent-mindedness, this unconscious element in the person who's being ridiculed. He uses this expression. He says it's like the ring of Ganges, not Ganges, Gyges. There it is, in reverse. Apparently, in ancient Greek mythology, there's a ring that the Gyges would wear, and he became invisible. He could see himself, but he was invisible to everyone else. But if you have the ring of Gyges in reverse, that means everyone else can see you, and you can't see yourself. So he's being clever there. And so comedy is like that. The person being ridiculed can't see themselves, but everybody else can see them. And then the comic artist who brings that out and exaggerates that even more, makes it obvious to everyone what this person can't see about themselves. Like when they ridicule politicians, for example, on Saturday Night Live or whatever. These are aspects of these people's character that they don't see, but everybody else can see it. And so the comic artist comes out, exaggerates it, everybody can see it, and it becomes comical. So where's the corrective element in that? Does it help the person? Well, maybe it does, maybe not. So we're sitting in the audience and we're watching Elizabeth, who's very vain. But she doesn't know she's being vain. Of course, she's Madeline Kahn is her name. I think she's dead now, but she does a very good job in this film. And she pretends to be vain, but she's not really vain, right? So we're sitting in the audience, we're watching this vain person. So the corrective is in the audience. We're learning how absurd it is to be so vain, and we're learning about vanity, how the vain person is oblivious to their own self-exaggeration, how everyone else can see it and they can't see it, how they think they're more than they are, and so on. There's the corrective. So the corrective can be a moral corrective, like in the case of vanity. It can be a metaphysical corrective, when the artist is showing how someone is being mechanically inelastic within a situation that calls for being adaptive to the situation. So the way, after having studied this book, I think the way of making it your own is see things that go through life and notice things that are humorous and laughable. And then go back to Bergson and see where this fits into Bergson's theory. Then you'll be able to understand Bergson better, and you'll be able to understand comedy better. Well, there's this one scene, for some reason, this comedian, Larry, the cable guy, he makes me laugh. And he said his cousin, they were at a funeral, and it's a very solemn situation. And suddenly they hear the opening up of a beer can. And they all look to see who it was, and it was his cousin. And his cousin looks up and goes, "What?" So that's ridiculous, because you don't open a beer can in the silence, of a eulogy at a funeral. So there's this reciprocal interference of events, that becomes comical. Okay, so it seems like a silly topic, comedy, and it hasn't been studied much by philosophers, but a few have taken it upon themselves to give some deep thought to it, and Bergson is one of them. I'm thinking of doing a whole course on comedy because some of my teachers at Penn State have written some really wonderful things on comedy, and I think it's definitely a phenomenon, and it's definitely something that's been around since probably the dawn of humanity, and it pervades every nation. And without it, it would be a paltry life to have nothing that evokes laughter and to have a world without comedy. And again, comedy is one of those things that sort of straddles two worlds. It has one foot in the realm of art and one foot in the realm of life. Usually those two worlds are worlds apart, in the world of fiction and art and the world of life. I mean, they're related, but they don't usually, there's usually not one phenomenon that straddles that in such a perfect way. And comedy is one of those things. It just happens in life, but it happens in art too. And there's different forms of art, like comic film, there's comic novels, there's comic operas, there's stand-up comedians. And so it serves this great function. That's why it stays around. And it serves a corrective function. So who knows what the world would be like without comedy. All right, so we're going to move on. I would like you to view the film Young Frankenstein. You can find it on YouTube or any other means you can find the book. It shouldn't be that hard to find. Okay, all right.